Uh, Our event tonight is part of our Education and Action series, and we've done about 10 of these, I think, on everything from anti-Semitism to climate change to the intersection of gender-based violence, the illusion and inclusion of systemic racism, how to be a good LGBTQ plus ally, and more. And all of our past forums are on our website, so feel free to visit those at Northern Nevada Marxist Forward. And I want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. And it's our responsibility to honor Indigenous peoples of the Great Basin. In the South, we honor the Southern Paiutes by their name, the Nuwuvi. In the North, from Pyramid Lake to the Mojave Desert, the Numi, the Northern Paiutes. Take pride with the pupfish, trout, and kuyui. We also honor the Western Shoshone, the Nui. Extending from Death Valley to the Ruby Mountains and beyond are ancestral lands of the Western Shoshone and Goshutes. Throughout the high desert to the alpine areas of Tahoe, the Washoe stories center around their beautiful lake. All Indigenous peoples have place names that were trade routes in areas dedicated for gathering, hunting, and healing. Indigenous peoples continue to have access to honor songs and prayers that bring a balance and an indebtedness to protecting the lands, the wildlife, and waters against sickness. We honor Indigenous teachings and the continued protection we seek for our Earth Mother. And I'd like to turn it over to our chair, Jackie Shelton, and she will do the rest of the introduction. And I also want to thank Jackie Shelton, who's led our organization so beautifully for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. I don't know, Jackie, how long. Jackie will be stepping down, and I will be filling enormous shoes. And luckily, she'll be helping us out from the background. So Jackie, please take it over.
Thank you, Jane. And I appreciate your kind words. And I know that it's going to be amazing. I'm excited to watch you take the lead. So we're very excited tonight in honor of Native American Heritage Month. We asked one of our board members, Debra Harry, to put together, to bring us a speaker to educate us about the Indigenous people specific to Nevada. And she brought us Dr. Debra Harry, and she is going to talk to us about the history, which is going to require us to challenge myths and engage in truth-telling to better understand the current situation, how we got here, and how we can all work together to create a more just future for the original peoples of our region. Dr. Harry is an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Race, and Identity at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her research analyzes the linkages between biotechnology, intellectual property, and globalization in relation to Indigenous people's rights. And I have no idea what any of that means, so I'm assuming that we're going to learn some different things as well. She earned a PhD in Faculty of Education from the University of Auckland. Dr. Harry is Numu, Northern Paiute, Kuyui, Tukadu from Pyramid Lake, Nevada. Dr. Harry, please, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. What an honor to be able to join you all. I know that I've always looked forward to the work with the Reno Women's March, and have met all of you in different circumstances around either the city or at the university. So I'm very happy to be here and to be able to give this presentation. I also saw in the chat that there are a number of visitors from outside of the region, and it's very much an honor to be able to visit with you all this evening. Let me introduce myself properly. Nu Debra Harry Minania, Nu Kuyui Dekara, Nu Kuyui Pa. Good evening, everybody. My name's Debra Harry. I'm from Pyramid Lake in Nevada. And let me start a PowerPoint for my presentation tonight. And I really appreciate the fact that you started this meeting with a land acknowledgement and to think about where we are. right? What the locality of where we are. And I like to remind people that every bit of what we call present day America or present day Canada or present day Mexico is originally Indigenous peoples' territories and homelands, and still is for those of us who have survived 550 odd years of onslaught of colonization. And so I think that it's only appropriate to think about that as we start this discussion, because I deliberately chose the title Challenging History, because typically what we learn in school or in our educational experience, or what we learn in the media, is kind of a one-sided, kind of a whitewashed understanding of history and who Indigenous peoples are. So I'm going to go ahead and start my PowerPoint and just answer the question in terms of who are the world's Indigenous peoples, and then I'll bring it on home, closer to home. So it's estimated that there are 380 million Indigenous people in 90 different countries around the world. Of the 7,000 languages spoken in the world, approximately 4,000 are spoken by Indigenous peoples, which really means that Indigenous peoples represent a majority of the world's cultural diversity. Indigenous peoples are stewards of approximately 80% of the world's biodiversity, and they continue to inhabit approximately 20% of the Earth's land base. Most Indigenous peoples live in a colonial state of domination and continue to face systemic assimilation and oppressive policies. I really like this photo because it really kind of expresses the difference between Indigenous peoples' relationship to land as compared to settler society. Indigenous peoples continue to occupy an estimated 20% of the Earth's land base and are stewards of 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. So this photo actually depicts the boundary point of the Menominee Nation's land, which is the forested side, as compared to the settler side in what is present day Wisconsin. And so you can see that, you know, they are master foresters. They take good care of their land, and it's bountiful and rich. And that's an example of why Indigenous peoples tend to be caretakers of the Earth's biodiversity. We don't clear cut. We don't do monocropping. So that tends to hold true. I want to talk a little bit about history because it's so important to kind of take a long view on how things came to be. And for Indigenous peoples, it's really critical to see what framework of domination and thinking and justification came with the colonial projects. So this is an example of a papal bull, which highlights the alliance between the Vatican and colonizing Christian countries, those being Spain, Italy, France, Britain, the Dutch, and so on, Portugal. And so what a papal bull is a mandate issued by the Vatican. And in this case, this is a mandate that was issued to Alfonso V of Portugal. And it authorized him to go into Africa and to, you can see in the highlighted letter, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. So what you see here is a reflection of the thinking of these European Christian countries that believed they had a divine right to go into all of the rest of the world and to take the lands and to claim whatever riches they found and to enslave the people for their own benefit. So the way the papal bulls work, this one issued in 1452, there's hundreds of them. There's papal bulls that were issued May 3rd and May 5th, 1492, which authorized the invasion into the Americas. They just kind of they build on previous papal bulls. They don't overtake them. They don't displace them. They just build on them. And to this day, none of the papal bulls have been revoked. And there have been calls by, various different Christian organizations that these papal bulls should be revoked, but that action has never been taken. And so what you have is this whole framework of belief that by divine right, these Christian European nations had a right to go into all other parts of the world where there were non-Christian people and to take everything from them. The terms like terra nullius, for instance, says that the land is empty and it's free for the taking by any discovering Christian nation, which basically means it's considered empty because the people that are there are not Christian, therefore they're not human. So it's considered empty land. Also, I think it's important to understand that the way that colonization happened was incredibly brutal and deadly for Indigenous peoples and other peoples around the world that were subject to this. This is Las Casas's writing from the book that was developed from his interventions called The Devastation of the Indies. And Las Casas actually was an eyewitness. He traveled with Columbus to the Americas. And what he saw I think he was a Dominican friar, what he saw made him go back to Spain and to engage in a public debate with Sepulveda around the need to treat Indigenous peoples as human beings. And that was the argument that he was making. So in his book, he talks about what he saw. He said, the Indigenous peoples by nature are the most humble, patient, and peaceable, holding no grudges. Free from embroilment, neither excitable nor quarrelsome. These people are the most devoid of rancors, hatreds, or desire for vengeance of any people in the world. Yet into the sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days. They laid bet as to who, with one stroke of the sword, could split a man in two, or could cut off his head, or spill out his entrails with a single stroke of the pike. They took infants from their mother's breast, snatching them by the legs and pitching them head first against the crags, or snatched them by the arms and threw them into the rivers, roaring with laughter and saying as the babies fell into the water, "Boil there, you offspring of the devil." Other infants they put to the sword along with their mothers and anyone else who happened to be nearby. So you can see that there's a really serious dehumanization process taking place here that would allow these Christian folks to be able to do this kind of thing. The Spaniards found pleasure in inventing all kinds of odd cruelties, the more cruel the better, with which to spill human blood. They built a long gibbet low enough for the toes to touch the ground and prevent strangling, and hanged 13 natives at a time in honor of Christ our Savior and the 12 apostles. When the Indians were thus still alive and hanging, the Spaniards tested their strength and their blades against them, ripping chests open with one blow and exposing entrails. And there were those who did worse. Then straw was wrapped around their torn bodies and they were burned alive. One man caught 2 children with about 2 years old, pierced their throats with a dagger and hurled them down a precipice. So the papal bulls, the ones that I saw in Seville, Spain, due to the work of a good colleague of mine, Steve Newcomb, who is, in my view, the preeminent scholar on the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery. Worked very hard to convince the museum director at the Archive of the Indies to allow us to view the 1492 papal bulls. They're written in Latin. They're written on lambskin, and what they would do is they would, unfold this document and read it to Indigenous people. And if they didn't surrender to the rule of the crown and the cross, then they were justified in killing them. And I talk about the doctrine of discovery as a process because it's that underlying belief system that European Christian countries and peoples had this assumed right to come into these other places and to take control, to dominate over them. And that's what the doctrine of discovery is about. It's that the first Christian nation to claim a place had first rights, regardless of whether there were people there already or not. As long as they were the first Christian nation, they gave themselves this assumed power to dominate and to control. So along with this claimed right of possession, they would enact symbolic acts, plant the flag, toss sand in the air, rip grass up, or whatever, right? Get down on their knees and do this prayer. And this is what Luis Rivera refers to as a religious act. Luis Rivera is a Puerto Rican historian and scholar. And in his book of Island Evangelism, he said what was taking place was actually a baptismal. And what they were doing was baptizing the land in the name of Christ. And then they had to rename the land after that with Christian names. And a part of that meant that they had to wipe off the pagan names. So that was all a deliberate process of colonization, to wipe off the pagan names and to rename the land in the name of Christian people. So the work that I think that our young Indigenous people, our geographers and so on are doing to reclaim place names is critically important for us as an essential act of decolonization. And then for the project to work, they have to institute Christian systems of punishment that's based on the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples, and then the use of deadly force and punishment to coerce and force participation and people to submit to this new rule in their territories. And then you have to establish colonial systems of domination once this is done. The new legal systems, the new governance systems, and so on. And finally, domination and dehumanization is embedded in the policies, practices, laws, and minds of the colonizers. And I say that all of these things are processed. And when we get to this final bullet point, we sort of don't really think about it as doctrine of discovery anymore, or discovering Christian nations. We think that this is just the way it is. And sorry. One thing I would say here is that David Stannard, in his book, American Holocaust, excellent resource to read. What he says is that in the first 100 years or so or less of the colonial countries coming to the Americas, especially in Latin America, he estimates that over 80 million Indigenous peoples died in a very short period of time. They were just completely wiped out during this period of time. So it was incredibly brutal. You don't hear the details, right? You don't hear the actual numbers in your you know, in your typical educational experience. And so we kind of grow up with myths about this process and how truly brutal it was. My friend Steve also likes to use this quote. He says, every civilization has a hidden code, a set of rules or principles that run through all of its activities like a repeated design. And when I think about this, one thing it makes me think about is, for instance, early Supreme Court decisions. I'm thinking about the Marshall Trilogy, which was decided in 3 court cases under Chief Justice John Marshall in the 1800s. The first case decided in 1823 was Johnson v. McIntosh. And it basically came up with a rule, a decision that said Indigenous peoples, because they're so savage and pagan, they cannot own land. They cannot own their own land. And only the federal government can own the land. The next decision was Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, decided in 1831, also in the Marshall Court. And what that decision basically said, or the impact of it, basically said that the federal government, the US government, has the right of domination over Native peoples, like that of a ward and a trustee. And then the Worcester v. Georgia decision, decided in 1832, basically said that that power or right of domination evolves to the federal government as plenary power, as absolute power over the lives of Indigenous peoples, and that states do not have any jurisdiction over Indigenous peoples. So these 3 cases continue to, these 3 cases, first of all, cited the doctrine of discovery as justification for the decision. Okay, so think about this. That colonial belief that, that colonial belief that these Christian nations had a right to go into these other places and take everything because everyone there is less than human, is cited in the Supreme Court. The doctrine of discovery was referenced most recently in 2005 in a case that was ruled against the Oneida's land rights. And it was mentioned by Chief Justice Ruth Ginsburg and cited again as justification for ruling against Oneida's land rights holdings. And then the last thing is, it turns out, Chief Justice John Marshall had a conflict of interest in the case, particularly in Johnson v. McIntosh. Some of the land that was in discussion actually belonged to him, and he was to benefit from this decision. So not only did they use racist language, they invoked the doctrine of discovery, and the Chief Justice had a conflict of interest in these cases. And I think any kind of rational legal view of these cases would say, hey, wait a minute, this is not right. We need to go back and review these cases. And other, racist cases have been overturned, but these 3 cases have been foundational in what's called a body of law called federal Indian law. My good friend, Peter Derrico, has just published a book called Federal Anti-Indian Law: The Legal Entrapment of Indigenous Peoples. And so what he's saying is that all of these cases of so-called law in America talk about a Native American or an Indian exceptionalism in law. For instance, a trustee is supposed to act as a fiduciary in the best interest of their wards. Well, in our case, as Indigenous peoples and the US government acting as trustee does no such thing. They do not act in the best interest of Indigenous peoples, and oftentimes even go against us in court, in the courts of law. Property. Indigenous peoples cannot own property, according to Johnson v. McIntosh. But yet in regular law, you cannot be alienated from your property, and that's a constitutional right, right? So what happens is that without understanding this history and having having an understanding how it has served as the foundation for what we see today in terms of the the legal foundations, the way that the government treats Indigenous people still today, it gains and establishes itself some kind of a legitimacy, because it becomes covered up, right? It becomes implemented in law. It becomes implemented in Supreme Court decisions. And most importantly, it actually becomes a part of the minds of the public. The public believes that this is the way it is, or that this is, that it's justified. And that's what Mueller is saying here, that the legitimacy confers authority on a system of domination, and that the underlying, it's only effective if the underlying principles have been internalized by the public. And so if there's this kind of broad-based, public perception of Indigenous peoples that assumes that they are, less than or whatever, there's not a lot of work being done to really seek justice for Indigenous peoples. And there's an ongoing erasure, there's an ongoing exclusion, there's an ongoing marginalization of Indigenous peoples and our relationship to our homelands, our territories, our ways of life, our cultures, our languages, all of the things that have been attacked by the colonial government continue to affect us. If you look at a definition of genocide, you would see that the whole boarding school experience fits the definition of genocide. And so there's no discussion in the American discourse that they have committed genocide, genocidal acts against Indigenous peoples for their 100+ year history of implementing a boarding school policy against Indigenous peoples. So that's why I wanted to use the term confronting historical myths, because you can't create justice, you can't develop strategies without first understanding basic truths. And that's kind of where we're at with the American public, that the American public, educated by Hollywood movies and all of the stereotypes and tropes that are continue to be perpetuated through media, and the lack of any kind of critical discourse in our public school systems, by and large, the American public just really doesn't understand who are Indigenous peoples, that we're kind of off in the shelf or not even in the public consciousness. That allows Western hegemony to proliferate, to perpetuate, that keeps us marginalized. I work within an academic institution, and I have to work hard to create a space for Indigenous knowledge systems to be talked about, to be shared, to be understood, and to be taught in our colleges. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of actually looking, in terms of actually seeking justice, real justice going forward. Finally, I would say that, the patriarchy and the objectification and exploitation of Indigenous women also came with the colonial project, and it is that old. Here you have Columbus talking about how it was easy to obtain a good price for young women, especially the very young girls from slave traders. This is a story, a horrific story of Sardie Bartman, a Khoisan woman from the present region of South Africa, who was objectified in Paris and in London. She was called the Hottentot Venus, and what they were doing was people would pay a fee to see her genitals and her buttocks. And actually, after she died, this Paris-based scientist actually kept those body parts in his collection and on display. Horrific story, and her people were finally successful in repatriating her back to her homeland in 2002. And this is just a picture from the British Museum. For Indigenous peoples, we have a lot of work that needs to be done. We didn't create these issues, we didn't create these problems, but the obligation to address them and to try to protect our lands, our waters, our children, our future generations, that falls on our shoulders. And so that's the work that we have ahead of us. We have to rebuild our nations because the federal government has done everything in its power to systematically deconstruct our nations. We have to address climate change, and we have many Indigenous peoples, not only in this country, but around the world, that are frontline affected communities and frontline protectors. We have to do our language revitalization, despite the fact that the federal government tried to beat that out of our children through the boarding school experiences. You know, the list goes on and on. I'm not going to cover each and every one of these, but you know, we have a lot of work that's really distinct to Indigenous peoples. For, you know, others should feel thankful that they don't have to address these kinds of damages to their peoples and to their homelands. But we do. We have to address these kinds of things. And we need allies. We need allies to really kind of get on the right side of history, to actually do something that protects the right of peoples to be self-determining. We are originally the free and independent peoples of this land. We've never walked away from that, despite everything that, you know, the government has done to force us into a state of perpetual domination. We still have that vision about who we are, and knowledge about who we are and where we belong. And we have a lot of work ahead of us. So I'm going to go ahead and end there, and maybe open it up for discussion. All right, I'm going to go. I have to go with you because you'll get locked out.
So feel free to put your questions in the chat. Dr. Harry, we have one question that came from Kitten Kalfi, and it says, what is TEK, T-E-K? And then Shay actually answered it. Traditional ecological knowledge. Okay, never mind.
Well, what we want to expand on that. On the traditional ecological knowledge. Oh, Dr. Harry just, she has her granddaughter with her, and she had to take a second. So she'll be right back. As horrifying as this information is, I'm really grateful for it, that we're allowed to learn.
And there's some great resources that we will capture in the chat. So thanks for those of you who put those in.
Yeah, and really good questions in there. Dr. Harry should be back in just a minute or so, and then we can ask her those questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, keep the questions coming.
Wow.
So this is Jane, Jackie, this is Beverly Harry. I just really want to thank everyone, the board as well, for bringing attention to this very needed education for Indigenous people. I think some parts of Debra's presentation, it's really sad, it's cruel, and we're living in a world that perpetuates this type of harm to the land and water as well, leaving a lot of contamination. And I'm really happy that we were able to get as many uh, uh, participants on this call, and just bring light to this really important subject, and the call for more individuals, more people from all societies to bring attention to these issues, as Debra pointed out.
Mhm. Thank you, Beverly.
While we're waiting, did want to let you know, we are having our next event will be live and in person on Monday, December 12th at Sierra Arts Foundation. We're having a nonprofit mixer. So if you are a member, either staff, board, volunteer for any nonprofit organization, please join us. It's from 5:30 to 7:30 at Sierra Arts Foundation. It's a potluck. So everybody just bring something to share and something, or perhaps something to drink, and just talk and get to know each other. We're not going to try to educate anybody, or we're going to just take a little bit of a break. But we do want to get to know everybody. And since it's been so long since we've been able to be in person, we really look forward to meeting you.
Mm. Got some great questions when Dr. Harry comes back. Thanks for your great questions, everybody.
I don't know if anybody, Beverly, or if anybody else wants to answer any of these questions while we're waiting. And thank you for putting the links in here. We'll put those, we'll get those on our website.
Just to enter my comment into the oral record here, I'd love to acknowledge Dr. Harry and thank her. Thank you, Dr. Harry, for your words of remembering and naming the truth. As we learn history with you tonight, could you please send my prayers for forgiveness on behalf of my colonizing ancestors, and the privilege it is that is my anti-colonial work to do now to your ears and to your ancestors. I'm grateful for this chance to learn with you all tonight, and cannot ask enough forgiveness for the damages done yesterday and today. This truth had to be called forward, and I thank you for this space to do it in tonight.
Thank you, Shay.
There she is.
Sorry, I had to leave on a short notice there. Hope you had a good discussion in my absence. Looks like there's a lot of activity here on the chat.
There is, and I'm happy to start bringing those to you, Dr. Harry. We're getting many questions that are similar. Of what can we do today to better help the Indigenous communities in our area? And how can allies really step up in a very supportive and helpful way?
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that Indigenous peoples are self-determining peoples. And so they're going to be addressing these issues in ways that make sense to them. And so allies need to be able to follow the lead
Mhm.
and to support that.
Are there any particular efforts underway right now that people could get involved in that you're aware of in our, especially in our Washoe County area of Northern Nevada?
Well, I'm sure you're aware of the struggle by the Fort McDermott Numo people to stop the lithium mine, and there's in a burial ground, I guess it affects one of their burial grounds. So that's an ongoing effort. If you think about the water situation in the whole western region of present day Nevada and the West, really, you know,
Mhm.
water is crucial. Water is life, and Indigenous peoples have been taking the lead to fight for water, fight for their right to water, to save their their lakes and their fisheries and so on. So that work needs to be done. And when you think about water, we're talking about water quality, you know, the contaminations that are taking place and
Yes, and I want
dams,
to
you
call
know.
out Beverly and Autumn, who've done many, many cleanups on the Truckee River and have pulled out dumpster fulls of trash. They've been amazing efforts over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not, you know, I don't know if you've ever read Frank Mullins, some of his historical writings on the region. He talks about the time when the river in the early days of the city of Reno, the river ran brown because it was so contaminated from all of the mining and activity, logging activity upstream, that it basically looked like coffee.
Oof.
You know, so that's been a ongoing issue, I think, with the Truckee River, the failure to take care of it.
Yes. We have a question from Lisa, and she says, with Thanksgiving coming around, as a public school teacher and now a school site coach for English development in elementary school, I really struggle with how to communicate a different way to begin the re-education about the holiday instead of the traditional way I grew up with the Pilgrims and the Indians, in a way that begins the change in our system. Suggestions from other teachers and especially from you, Dr. Harry.
Yeah, I know there's some other teachers here on the chat. I see some have posted already, so I don't know if we need to address that.
Okay. Tony asks from Monique, what is the Indigenous attitude to white people who involve themselves in issues affecting the Indigenous groups?
What is the Indigenous attitude?
Yeah, what's the feeling when white people get involved in many issues that affect Indigenous peoples?
Well, that's a really general
I know.
question, and I don't think I can answer it. I think what you're looking for is right relations, being good neighbors, being respectful, um, having gratitude, being compassionate. And I think that's just basic, you know, basic human relations. And that's what we want.
And I think earlier you said to follow, to not try to lead any of these efforts, but to be a good ally and follow the lead.
To follow the lead of Indigenous peoples addressing Indigenous issues that affect them. Yes.
Yes. Let's see, Adrian that just says it has a comment. It's a reminder of the importance to question our beliefs about Indigenous history and those of other historically oppressed groups. Tina asked, Dr. Harry, can you speak to what actions Secretary Deb Haaland is taking to address the issues you spoke of tonight related to Indigenous lands and rights? And I would also probably say renaming places.
I can't give too much detail on what's taking place within the Department of Interior. She's able to do what she can within the confines of the government as head of one of the federal agencies. So, and she's done some good initiatives, kind of turning back some of the Trump era actions that brought harm to places like Bears Ear and so on. So, I think she's doing some great work from her position.
Great. Kitten asks, do you recommend that more people in Nevada read Sand in the Whirlwind?
I actually use that in my class. What I recommend is people understand local history. I teach at the college level. The majority of my students are non-Indigenous, probably at least half or 75, 80% of the students are from the local region. And in my courses, I start with local history first, and most have never, ever heard of the Pyramid Lake War. It's their first exposure to the Pyramid Lake War in all of their academic experience. And, after students go through my courses, they often express some outrage by saying, why was my educational experience so whitewashed? Why was I never taught the truth? Why did I have to come to a class taught by an Indigenous professor to learn some of these basic truths?
Yeah.
And that really speaks volumes, I think, to what students are being exposed to in mainstream educational systems. And that gets back to the Western hegemony and the perpetuation of the American narrative and American myth, all to justify, the ongoing domination and exclusion of Indigenous people. So, that work has to happen. It's just as long as people have blinders on and they're not able to learn truth, then there's not much hope for change.
Yes. Can you recommend a book on the Pyramid Lake War for folks?
No, what I've had to do is piece together different resources. For instance, Farrell Egan, I think, is the author of Sand in the Whirlwind. And, it's a good book. He's a historian. He specialized in writing on the gold rush in California. And, he takes a look at the issue from a historical perspective as a white person. I think he takes some liberties in retelling a story. And so, that's what you get. There's some interesting accounts in the Nevada Historical Society. So you kind of have to piece together information from different sources to try to get a good idea of what really took place.
And for those who don't know, there is a wonderful museum at Pyramid Lake that has so many fantastic displays, and you do get quite a bit of history. It's very much, I encourage everybody to visit that museum. Is it a museum or a historical center?
Yeah, it's a museum and cultural center. It's a very good source of information.
Yes,
There's actually a wonderful exhibit right now at the airport from the Stewart Indian School, which is great because everybody has to walk through it and see and experience all of that on their way to the gates.
That's great. So this is not me who wrote this question. I think it's Brian who signed in with my link because I gave it to him. And he just wants to reiterate, Dr. Harry, you demonstrated here that evil thrives in silence and darkness. Thank you for exposing these terrible aspects of our history. Only by calling this out and challenging it can we become more compassionate as a society.
Thank you.
Brian. And there are absolutely some fabulous resources, so we will collect those and save the chat. Thank you, everybody who's putting these resources in. And of course, about what's going on at Thacker Pass. It's the peopleofredmountain.com. So everybody please visit that site and learn about what's happening there. Lots of classroom teachers, a lot of thank yous to you, Dr. Harry. Really appreciate your gift of knowledge and the historical context, and have the utmost respect for you and your work. And that's Gabrielle from the, I'm not sure if I'm going to say that, Gabrielle, right? The Monacan ancestral land.
Thank you.
And do you recommend Nurburn's trilogy?
Pardon?
Tony asks if you recommend the Nurburn's trilogy. Nerburns, Nurburn's.
And I'm not familiar with it.
Okay.
Neither wolf nor dog.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of people are commenting they just never learned anything like this in K through 12 and very little in college. Debra Achtenberg, Dr. Achtenberg asks, can you tell everyone about Indigenous language revival efforts in Northern Nevada?
Yeah, I'm happy to the extent that I can. Almost every community in our region has some kind of a language revitalization program or efforts taking place within their communities, from preschool through elementary school. And then even here at the university, we have 4 levels of Numu language being taught at the college level. So there's some good work going on. I would say that all of our languages in this region are in the red zone, and much work needs to be done to revitalize. And the burden falls on Indigenous peoples to kind of pick up different strategies and to fund and their work, but it's absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good. I'm not quite sure I'm getting the question, but Megan says, what in your opinion is a good way to reframe the conversation from white guilt to Indigenous peoples healing? I'm not sure where you might want to go with that.
Okay, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think we have to think about, really what is justice, what is social change, and how do we achieve that, especially for those who have been the most marginalized, that have been the most vulnerable. It's addressing the wrongs that have been done and finding strategies towards reparations, towards, I don't want to use the word reparations, but towards justice. And if you listen to what Indigenous peoples are saying, they're coming up with some interesting, solutions. There's a vibrant land back movement, for instance. And guess what? People are giving land back, to different Indigenous peoples. They've been successful. And especially knowing the history that the land was taken under fraudulent means, that there has to be support for this process. So yeah, I think guilt is a negative motivator. I think we can find positive motivators that keep everybody on the same page, working towards common visions for a more just society in future.
Awesome. That's great. Are you aware of any efforts by Indigenous peoples in Nevada to recommend the designation of a new national monument to the Biden administration to safeguard lands that are considered sacred by Indigenous people?
I'm not sure what that question is referring to. Is it a national monument in Washington, D.C. or?
No, I think it's asking if there's any efforts here in northern Nevada or in Nevada for designating any land as potentially national monuments for protection, any lands that are considered sacred. And I think some happened in the last Nevada legislative session. I'm not remembering the areas, but I think, is anybody here aware of that? In our last legislative session, there were a few bills.
Yeah, I think that might be misdirected energies. I mean, if you really want to restore land justice for Indigenous peoples, honor the Western Shoshone Treaty of 1863, right? Recognize Indigenous peoples' rights to territoriality, to their own homelands, to their own territory. Those are the things that have to be done. And you could even look at, the establishment of Nevada as a territory, which specifically excludes inclusion of Indigenous peoples' lands. That all of Nevada is this except Indigenous peoples' territories, right?
Yes.
Just like the Northwest Ordinance did. All of this is going to the US except Indigenous peoples' territories. Like there's been a succession after succession of land grab that has been illegal according to the, kind of the organic documents of this country.
Yes.
And so there's injustice after injustice after injustice to take Indigenous peoples' land. So we don't need more monuments, that exclude us from the land. We need our land back.
Yes. Absolutely. Lots of thanks. Beverly wrote BRB. Bev, what does that mean?
Be right back.
Oh, be right back. Thank you. Thank you. Again, lots and lots. Please, everybody, you can save the chat if you want, and we will try to also capture it, but you hit the 3 little dots on the bottom and you can hit save chat and get some of these incredible resources. Brian.
I should have put LB, which would be land back.
Land back. Okay. The proposed, I'm not going to be able to say that, Brian. If you can unmute, you can, saving the swamp cedars. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that because I will not do a good job of that. And also the Abi Kiwa Ame. Probably not saying that. Yes, Brian.
Yeah, I might be butchering it, but I think it's Basawabi.
Basawabi.
And then the campaign in the south is the Avikwame, proposed national monument. And both of those had bills that passed last legislature moving them forward, but I can't remember the bill numbers, but you can look them up on the state legislature site, the Nellis site. Having said that, I appreciate Dr. Harry's comments about respecting treaties, and that might be the better direction we need to head.
Super. I hope I didn't skip over questions. Again, there's just so many thank yous in the chat to you, Dr. Harry. If anybody wants to just speak out a question, I think we can be a little bit informal. Kitten put in a long description of the park, the national monument in the south. So, well, this has been very eye-opening for all of us. Thank you, Dr. Harry, and thank you who put the beautiful apology in. And I think we all feel that. I think that was Shay. Just deep apologies for what happened in this history and what our ancestors did. And may we have the power and fortitude and courage to do the work that needs to be done to help with the healing that must happen. Let me see if there's another question that just more thanks. So,
yeah, I like that. She has anti-colonial work. That's the work we all have ahead of us.
Yes, great. So I want to also thank Beverly for inviting Dr. Harry to. Beverly is also on the board of our organization and very instrumental in the work we do. And Beverly, thank you so much for inviting Dr. Harry to share her wisdom with us, her knowledge, her ideas, her recommendations. We're just getting so many messages of thanks. I know that people are inspired to learn more. We have so many great resources here. I want to once again, as Jackie said, invite all of you to come to our December mixer. And there's in the link, there's an Eventbrite. Jackie, do you want to just put that in a regular chat so people can copy that down? And again, this is just thank you for your time. We really appreciate you. And UNR is so lucky to have you on their faculty and all the students that you touch in your classes.
I hope they realize that.
I hope so too. I hope so too. So I encourage all of us to share some of this as you go to your family celebrations these holidays, and to start challenging these myths of what we know about Thanksgiving, and to think about in our own families what we can do to start this repair work and to really dig into it. Jackie, anything else you want to say, or Beverly, words of goodbye?
We will edit this into a recording. We'll have it on our website by the weekend. So, and we'll send out an email to let you know when it's ready. And thank you again, Dr. Harry, so very much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you, Deb. You know, your education is always so needed in these spaces. And of course, Deb is my late husband's younger sister. Both of them are just brilliant, and just brought a lot of education to these areas, and they're you know, protecting Indigenous rights and protecting water.
Thank you, Bev. Thanks again for organizing this. Appreciate it so much.
Right. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight and committing to your knowledge and learning. And can someone copy and save the chats? Yes, we will have that done, Richard. So again, Dr. Harry, thank you so much. Beverly, everybody who attended, have a lovely rest of your evening, and hopefully we'll see you in December.
Okay, thank you.
Take good
Bye.
care.